Hello everyone, in this video, I will be recapping the chapter 2 of the manhwa called Mightiest Melee Magician. As Lewin slowly opened his eyes in the dream space, he was met with the sight of a towering avatar before him. Talk about a wild awakening. He couldn't help but wonder what on earth was going on. The avatar started yakking away, but at first, it was all gibberish to Lewin. Like, what language was that? But then, out of nowhere, the avatar called out Lewin's name. Lewin's mind was racing. How did this giant avatar know his name? Before he could wrap his head around it, he started hearing a voice in his noggin calling out to him. Suddenly, he snapped back to reality as someone was calling his name for real. Opening his eyes a crack, Lewin spotted a figure standing in front of him. And who was it? None other than Helen, the big shot professor and healing magician from Ignite Academy. With her distinctive yellow hair and orange eyes, she was hard to miss, especially with that white coat over her orange shirt. Helen looked like she'd seen a ghost when Lewin finally stirred. She practically begged to know if he was awake. Slowly coming to his senses, Lewin took in his surroundings with narrowed eyes. In a rush, he pulled himself up from the bed, with Helen lending a helping hand. Turning to face Helen, Lewin fired off questions in a jittery tone, trying to figure out where the heck he was. Helen calmly explained they were in the recovery room and insisted he should chill and stay lying down. But Lewin was having none of it. He insisted he was okay to sit up, even though he still felt like he'd been hit by a truck. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he recalled getting knocked out by Ben's magic. That dream he just had? It was still fresh in his mind, like he'd just binge-watched a movie. Pulling himself together, Lewin asked Helen how long he'd been out cold. Helen dropped the bombshell. Nearly a whole day. Lewin blinked in disbelief, thanking his lucky stars he wasn't seriously injured. After a moment of silent reflection, he turned to Helen with a furrowed brow and popped the big question. Was he going to be all right? The professor dropped a bombshell on Lewin, informing him they needed to run some more tests to be absolutely sure he was all right. But despite that, she couldn't help but mention how surprisingly good Lewin looked considering he took a lightning bolt head-on. Like, seriously, how was he not frazzled to a crisp? She went on to explain that there wasn't a single scratch or burn on his skin, not even any internal damage. It was like he was made of rubber or something. Lewin felt sweat bead on his forehead as he stared blankly at the professor, trying to wrap his head around the miracle that was his unscathed body. Raising his hand that had blocked the lightning attack, he marveled at its pristine condition. It was mind-boggling. Lightning magic was supposed to be terrifying, capable of frying you up like a shrimp in a second. And yet, here he was, standing without a scratch. Lost in his thoughts, Lewin was interrupted by someone entering the recovery room. They requested Professor Helen to step out for a private chat with Lewin. Giving Lewin a reassuring pat on the back, Professor Helen left, reminding him to holler if anything felt off. In walked Heidel, Lewin's combat professor, getting straight to the point and asking how Lewin was holding up. Lewin nodded, putting on a brave face and assuring the professor he was A-okay. The professor couldn't help but marvel at Lewin's luck, escaping a potentially deadly showdown unscathed. He then dropped a bombshell of his own. Ben Folt, the troublemaker who fried Lewin, was getting the boot. Expelled for using magic with malicious intent and spreading lies about the Ardell family? Talk about karma biting back. Lewin listened in silence as the professor spilled the beans. Head bowed. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. What consequences would he face for giving Ben a taste of his own medicine? With a heavy heart, he finally mustered the courage to ask the professor. The professor laid it out for Lewin, revealing that his punishment had been decided during the meeting. Taking everything into account, they decided Lewin would be doing a month of volunteer service at the academy. Lewin didn't argue, just nodded in acceptance, taking his punishment like a champ. After giving Lewin a moment to process, the professor threw another curveball. Out of the blue, he asked if Lewin possessed some kind of artifact, those legendary weapons from ancient magicians that pack unlimited mana. Lewin's eyes widened in surprise, sweat starting to bead on his forehead. Artifact? He scratched his head, perplexed. Denying it, he explained to the professor that if he had something like that, he wouldn't have been bullied all this time. The professor pondered for a moment, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. He agreed, reasoning that such valuable artifacts would likely be in the hands of the Ardell family head, not passed down to Lewin. Lewin raised an eyebrow, curious as to why the professor was asking. After a moment of silence, the professor revealed something that made Lewin sit up straight. When Ben hit him with that lightning magic, the professor saw a red light surrounding Lewin, like some top-tier artifact shielding him. Lewin's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. It sounded eerily familiar to the dream he had, where he encountered a colossal avatar. But shaking off the notion, he insisted he didn't have any such artifact. The professor accepted his denial, turning to leave. He advised Lewin to get some rest before he left. Watching his professor go, Lewin couldn't help but wonder what the heck was going on. After the professor bid farewell, Lewin was left in a whirlwind of thoughts. He'd spilled the beans about the fight, yet the professor didn't press further. It left him scratching his head, wondering what was going on in his mentor's mind. Plopping down on his bed, he furrowed his brow, lost in contemplation. As he sat there, Lewin couldn't shake the feeling that his dream held more significance than he realized. It was so vivid, almost like it was happening for real. He mulled over the strange voices he'd heard. Artifact, Draka, the destroyer of the world, and something about being a player. Rubbing his chin, he racked his brain, trying to remember if there was anything else. Then it hit him like a ton of bricks. Status window, he blurted out loud. And just like that, a virtual screen materialized before him, leaving him utterly dumbfounded. His heart raced, teeth clenched, eyes wide as saucers, and sweat trickling down his face. He stumbled back in shock, blurting out in disbelief, "What the hell is this?" Suddenly, the door burst open, and Professor Helen rushed in, clutching Lewin's reports. She must have heard his cry. Racing toward Lewin's bedside with worry etched on her face, Helen's heart pounded as she bombarded him with questions about his well-being. Lewin, still glued to the virtual screen, gestured towards it and asked Helen if she could also see the mysterious blue object. Hearing Lewin's jumbled words, Helen breathed a sigh of relief, glad to see him conscious. However, she couldn't decipher what he was mumbling about, prompting her to move closer and ask for clarification. Reassuring him that there was nothing visible to her, she gently probed to ensure he was feeling all right. Then, it hit Lewin like a bolt of lightning. His eyes widened, his jaw tensed as the realization sank in. He was the sole witness to the enigmatic blue screen. Displayed before him was his status, proclaiming him as the reincarnation of Draka, the infamous destroyer of worlds. Draka's quest for boundless power led to his demise, much like Lewin's own struggle with mana control. However, unlike Draka, Lewin possessed a technique to substitute mana with sheer strength. The artifact player he now held once belonged to Draka, offering power through various quests. His status boasted a strength of 150, agility of 100, and wisdom reaching an impressive 1550. In the aftermath, Lewin, grappling with the revelation, decided to play down the incident with the professor to avoid any complications. He casually brushed it off as an illusion, hoping to evade further scrutiny. The professor, though amused, wasn't entirely convinced by Lewin's explanation. Meanwhile, Helen handed over his test results, confirming his well-being and granting him permission to return to his dormitory. Grateful for their understanding, Lewin expressed his thanks to the professor before retreating to the recovery room for a much-needed rest, eventually making his way back to his dormitory. After returning to his dorm, Lewin couldn't shake off the whirlwind of thoughts swirling in his mind from the day's events. Surviving a lightning strike, encountering that eerie red-eyed avatar, and puzzling over the mysterious status window that only he seemed to see. It was a lot to process. The revelation that he might be the incarnation of Draka, along with the idea that the magician's artifact player called Draka might now be his, only added to the confusion. Hours passed, yet Lewin remained lost in contemplation, unable to make sense of it all. As night fell over Ignite Academy, Lewin sought solace in the familiar setting of the training grounds. There, amidst the dimming light, he noticed another screen beside the status window, a quest window. Intrigued, he tapped on it, revealing a repeatable quest. The task? To train his body in preparation for increased strength, as befitting a player connected to Draka. He had to complete 100 punches, kicks, and spin kicks to earn a reward of 10 stat points in strength. With a mixture of determination and curiosity, Lewin rolled up his sleeves, ready to tackle the challenge. Despite his doubts about how Knight's moves could benefit his magic, he pushed them aside. After all, he'd been feeling like a loser for 6 years. Now was not the time to hesitate. Taking a deep breath, he threw his first punch, and the progress bar on the quest screen instantly responded. Encouraged, he continued, each strike adding to his sense of accomplishment. But then, frustration struck. One punch, and the progress bar stubbornly refused to budge. Scratching his head, Lewin wondered what went wrong. It dawned on him that even the smallest mistake halted his progress. After a moment of reflection, he resolved to approach the task with renewed focus and precision. As the night wore on, Lewin's breath grew heavy, sweat cascading down his face. With each move, he pushed himself harder, determined to finish the quest. Finally, with a sense of relief and exhaustion, he completed the last kick, collapsing to the ground in a mixture of triumph and fatigue. The quest window lit up, signaling that Lewin had successfully completed the task and earned himself 10 points in strength. Plus, as a bonus, it unlocked the skills window. Wiping the sweat from his brow, Lewin stared at the screen, feeling a mix of excitement and curiosity about his newfound reward. Suddenly, he felt something different, something stirring inside him. Raising his hand, Lewin couldn't help but analyze his own body. It was like a strange sensation coursing through his veins, something deeper than mana, like the very essence used to perform magic. Clenching his fists, he realized that this was the strength he'd been yearning for all these years, a feeling of empowerment unlike anything he'd experienced before. With determination, he took a stance and focused all his newfound strength into his right fist, ready to unleash it. With a powerful strike, Lewin felt the air crackle around him as his punch tore through the atmosphere, creating a thunderous boom. A grin spread across his face as he realized that his magic had become infused with this newfound strength, faster, stronger, and more destructive than ever. Looking at his hand in awe, he could sense the fundamental shift in his abilities. But the surprises didn't end there. Curious about the other reward he'd received, the skill unlock, Lewin called up the status window. A new skill, Force Circle, popped up on the screen. It was a passive ability that replaced mana with strength, altering the very essence of his magic. The skill description hinted at how his movements and magic would now be influenced by his strength. Reading through the details, Lewin's mind raced with possibilities. The idea that his mana circles would be replaced by force circles left him both intrigued and bewildered. Placing a hand over his chest, he felt the sweat trickling down his face as he pondered the implications. According to magical principles, the mana circles around a magician's heart played a crucial role in harnessing and controlling mana. The more mana a magician could control, the more circles they'd have. But now, with this new skill, everything seemed poised to change. Lewin had always been a bit of an oddball compared to the other kids his age, sporting not one or two, but 4 mana circles. But here's the kicker, thanks to his annoying mana evocation disability, those circles might as well have been invisible. Frustrated, he slapped a hand over his heart and shut his eyes, hoping to make sense of his mana circles. Suddenly, he jerked back, eyes wide with shock. Something was off. His hard-earned mana circles had vanished, replaced by a single, wild loop swirling around his heart, the Force Circle. Lewin's mind raced with disbelief, sweat trickling down his face. He instinctively raised his hand, wondering if this new circle meant his old mana ones were toast. After all, according to everything he'd learned, you couldn't be a magician without those circles. His heart sank at the thought of losing his magician status if this Force Circle didn't measure up. But then he shook himself out of the funk. It was too soon to give in to despair. With a gulp, he resolved to put this new circle to the test before jumping to conclusions. Taking a deep breath, he summoned the simplest spell he could think of, a fireball. And poof, there it was, a massive fireball hovering over his palm in an instant. Lewin's jaw practically hit the floor. The casting time had slashed drastically, and the fireball's power had multiplied several times over. How was this even possible? In that moment, as he marveled at the sheer potency of his magic, it hit him like a bolt of lightning, the power of an artifact. A grin spread across Lewin's face. This was a game changer. With his newfound strength, who knew what he could accomplish? That's all for today's episode. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts and suggestions.